Kia ora koutou. We have 50 people joined in now. Hopefully not too many joining late, but I'll just hand over to Miles to formally welcome us.
Tēnā koutou, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Miles Lind. I am the President of IPWA New Zealand. Welcome to this briefing on the Three Waters reform. It's really great to have you all with us today. And we're really excited to have Richard and Josephine from Internal Affairs with us today to help give us a greater understanding of these upcoming reforms and I guess to hear it firsthand. But also it gives us an opportunity to have a safe place to ask questions. So there's an opportunity through the Q&A part of this webinar to raise your questions, and they'll be picked up, if not through the presentation, then at the end of the presentation. Look, these sessions are really important for us. It's important for our members that they're informed and that as change happens, you remain informed and connected with what's happening. But also it's important that you do hear it firsthand. Hearing whispers and rumours and stuff like that can be a real distraction to trying to do good work for our communities. But look, this reform isn't the first reform that's ever happened in New Zealand. We were just sort of talking about some of the ones that we've seen historically. So I've known Richard now since about 2012. We did a piece of benchmarking work together on the Auckland water sector, which was obviously part of the Auckland reforms in 2010, but we also had local government reforms in 1989. There was proposed water reforms in 2001 on the back of a report by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, which never went through. NZTA and the transport sector had major reforms in 2008. But here we find ourselves in 2020, 2021, looking at the water sector again. So look, reforms are nothing new, but what's important is we engage with them and make sure we get what's best for our sector. We've all had some frustrations in the past, so this is our opportunity to start getting it right. So I would like to welcome Richard Ward, who is the Partnership Director of Three Waters at the Department of Internal Affairs, and alongside him is Josephine Clark, who is the Three Waters Comms and Engagement Manager. So welcome everybody. Over to you, Richard and Josephine.
Well, kia ora, thanks Miles and Murray. I'm just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping for this webinar. Hopefully my screen is sharing now. Yep. Yeah. Throughout this webinar, you will be on mute and we will not be able to hear you. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tab rather than the chat function. That way, when we take questions at the end, we can work through them together. And we will make sure we have enough time for questions at the end of this session. Just please note that we are recording this session, so when we do pause for questions, you can use the raise hand function to be enabled to ask your question verbally. However, you will be recorded and your username will appear. So please send all your questions to all panelists so that we can see them as we go.
Cool. And thanks, Joey, and yeah, my welcome as well. So ko Richard Ward taku ingoa, and as Miles said, I'm sort of leading out with Alan Pregmore around this Three Waters reform from sort of DIA. And yes, it does have a very, very long history, and we are really in what I would just describe now as the latest incarnation of where the Three Waters is sort of thinking and sort of has been. And in fact, when we ran an Auckland workshop last year, Mayor Goff talked then about the fact that he was a cabinet minister back in the day, and they were also debating around the cabinet table, you know, Three Waters and Three Waters reform, and it just constantly gets shelved because it's too hard, seen as too hard, too complex, and too difficult. So what we'll run through today is a little bit about what the program is. We'll talk a little bit about the key reform questions that we're going to do. We'll jump a little bit into establishment and sort of transition and where that goes, and then a discussion around the time frame, and then sort of finish with what the next steps are. You will be aware that we are in the process of engaging quite heavily with local government and with iwi Māori at the moment, and we've had 6 workshops, regionally based workshops across the country. I had Christchurch yesterday, and we've got Rotorua on Friday, and then Whangarei next week. And in between that, we are talking a lot to sort of councils as well, and we've done a number of sort of industry briefings, discussions, because as Miles says, it's really important that you people are well informed of what the general program and time frame is, so that when you are in councils and working with people who might be impacted by it, that you've got a good level of knowledge as well. So look, please do ask us questions as we go. Put the type the questions in, and Joey will give me a bit of a nudge if there's something that relates to just what we're talking about now, and it's useful to answer that. So I'm not going to run right through the history back to the 90s and even before that. This latest incarnation really got some legs with the inquiry into the Havelock North drinking water incident. And what that inquiry report said was that our overall three water system was broken. And that's actually a really key message as we're sort of getting to councils. This is not about local authority failings or the fact that we're pointing blame or fingers or anything at them. It's as much about central government's failure. It is just a collective system failure around the three waters, with lots of different components, and very, very little, if any, of the system players actually covering themselves with any sort of glory. That inquiry then sort of focused first of all around the regulatory sort of elements, and the first priority was the establishment of a new water services regulator focusing on drinking water, Taumata Arawai. That went live at the beginning of this month, so it is now an actual legal entity as of 24 days ago, and it now has a sort of chief executive with Bill Bayfield. Alongside that, we also have the regulatory work with the Water Services Bill, which is currently at Select Committee. So that establishes some of the regulatory system and regime that will sit around the three waters. And so that was really the big focus for the first 2 to 3 years. And then the service delivery side of it was sort of put a little bit on the back burner, and we were encouraging councils and working with councils on gathering information, but also sort of promoting, I guess, a voluntary reform sort of approach. Last year was obviously COVID, and government had a real concern about the slowdown in the economy, and local government potentially having had a big revenue hit would actually pull right back on the investment. And so using the sort of the economic stimulus sort of angle, government invested sort of around about $560 million into the three water system via councils, and used that as a real turbocharge to this reform, the service delivery reform sort of program. And that was formalised in May last year with a partnership approach sort of agreed with the local government sort of sector. And that was between the Prime Minister and her senior ministers and sort of the leadership of local government via LG&Z. So that's really what we've been doing since about May. We have a joint steering committee set up, chaired by Brian Hanna, but having a number of different mayors and chief executives, etc., that sit on that, plus a number of government agencies. And we have been working through what a new service delivery arrangement would look like for the three waters. Where we're up to is that we are now taking where the work has got to back out to councils and to iwi and hapu and Māori across the country. And so that is sort of the focus this month really of what the workshops are that we are running. Not going to run too much through in terms of the quick overview. You know most of this. And I've just talked about a couple of those sort of key elements. The reform, again, you people are more closely linked than at the coalface in many cases of what these are. What we typically find is that this is very, very well understood in the issues and the problems, especially down in the I guess the layers within sort of councils and within sort of advisory services. And a lot of the time actually we need to spend communicating is more to the elected officials, because this is obviously quite a complex sort of area. But it is all about ultimately health and environmental sort of outcomes. It is about housing demand. You saw the announcements yesterday around funds in terms of infrastructure, etc. for housing. And look, we know that we have social well-being, and we also have economic well-being and growth, which is impacted by water or the unavailability of it or constraints on the infrastructure. Government has been really clear that it although it is sort of a partnership model with local government, that this is, government has had some pretty clear expectations about what it wants the service delivery reform to end up with. And so there's been a series of sort of cabinet papers, and the latest one is on our website actually, and it was from December last year. And that's quite important because that means it's post-government and post-election. So election has happened, new government has come in, and they have reconfirmed and also signed off some more details about what the program is to deliver and what they see as the critical sort of success factors of it. So we are talking about shifting water services away from the 67 sort of councils that operate it now, deliver it now, and into new multi-regional entities of scale. So 3 to 5 is the common number that you'll hear the government sort of talk about. That's what they see as the right number for New Zealand. Now, whether it's 3, whether it's 5, whether it's 2, whether it's 6, the conversations and the work that we've got underway at the moment. They are really clear that it must be publicly owned. And they have tasked us as officials to try and build in as many mechanisms as what we possibly can to prevent sort of the future privatisation of these. Obviously, Parliament Parliament can't bind another Parliament, so just creating a law won't do that. And a lot of our design and how we're thinking about what a water entity looks like and the system that it operates in is about also trying to prevent this future privatisation. I can be really clear that these won't be CCOs, they won't be Crown entities, they won't be community trusts. They are likely to borrow elements from all of those plus others, but these will be fit for purpose, bespoke Aotearoa entities that we will then put into legislation. So that's what we mean by them being statutory sort of entities. Really important that they have good governance, good management, and so the whole competency-based boards is quite critical, professional directors. I mean, these will be very, very, very large utility companies, and it's really important that we get the right calibre of people on those boards to be able to govern and direct them. And then there's 2 there which are very related in terms of the sort of the design features. They will own their own assets. Okay, so we are not talking here about a water care model. We're not talking here about a Wellington Water sort of model. We are talking about something different that both owns its assets and is separate from local authorities. So not counted on local councils' balance sheets. Not subject to the same sort of LGFA debt covenants, not subject to the same net debt revenue sort of limits, and are able to utilise a wide range of funding and financing tools in order to put through a very, very large investment sort of program. And if you look at those success factors, they largely sort of mirror what the proposals are. And the one that we haven't really sort of touched on there is that it's really important that we build in strong mechanisms here for enabling iwi hapu and sort of community input, because there is a fear that we create water services entities and restructure this. Then at the moment it moves out of sort of democratically elected council control. How do we make sure that consumers are protected, that communities have a level of influence as they do now with councils? Fundamentally though, the problem is actually really quite a simple problem. It is that we have been underinvesting in our waters infrastructure for a long period of time. And we are seeing the effects of that sort of all over the country. We live in Wellington. Wellington has pipes exploding literally on a weekly sort of basis, but it's certainly not unique to Wellington. And so there's been a very poor, I guess, level of information. And so as we've gone through this process over the last couple of years, more and more has become sort of revealed. And the size of, I guess, the infrastructure deficit, or the amount that we need to really be investing over the next 30 years has sort of continued to grow. So we're at the moment, sort of at the point where we're talking around about sort of up to 70 to $96 billion is required to be invested over the next 30 years. Now, that all doesn't need to be invested on day one, and we're talking about a sector that at the moment that invests around about $1.5 billion a year of capex into 3 waters. If if you sort of multiply that out, you get a run rate there of about $45 billion, over the 30 years. So we are talking about that plus, a lot more. So a doubling, potentially tripling of, what the current level of investment is into Three Waters. So that is, in a way, that is the nutshell. I mean, we are either trading off health or environmental outcomes by not making a good level of investment, or we are actually making the investment to ensure that we have a financially sustainable and we are achieving clean water and safe drinking water for people of Aotearoa. Within what I will say is just sort of probably a comment that I'll sort of may not repeat too much, but it just sort of underpins almost the whole thinking around where we're going with this. There is enough money in the system to be able to make this level of investment, but just not as the system is currently set up. The system is currently designed and it is sort of constructed in the way that it operates. So it's not like there is going to necessarily be a huge amount of more money that sort of needs to sort of come in. There will need to be more money sort of coming in, but actually there is an awful lot of efficiency dividends that we can make to make that actually that level of investment actually quite affordable. In terms of the affordability challenges, no surprises. Obviously, if you're in Auckland, then you are quite well placed in terms of meeting the level of investment that is required over the next 30 years. Likewise, if you're in a larger metro, then also you're fairly well placed. But then once you get into the provincial, and then particularly once you get into the rural sort of councils and areas, then your ability to be able to fund this becomes severely constrained, and to the point where it will actually become sort of unaffordable. So provincial councils is probably 1.5 to twice what they're spending at the moment. Metros even so, it's about 1.4 to 1.8 times. Now, this analysis has been undertaken for us by the Water Industry Commission of Scotland, WICS for short. WICS are the economic regulator for Scotland, and they also do a large amount of, sort of consulting and advisory work across the world and across a number of different jurisdictions and countries, sort of advising on this. They have a very well sort of regarded and internationally accepted sort of group of models, and we have just been through a process with councils, which some of you have possibly been involved in, where we caused an awful lot of pain and heartache over Christmas to a number of people, and undertaken the single largest sort of data collection exercise for Three Waters, with up to about 14,000 data lines collected from individual councils. That is all going through a sort of an analytical process at the moment and being run through the Water Industry for Commission for Scotland sort of models and their sort of analysis. And we're also getting that peer reviewed and those sort of levels of assumption. So these are how we're sort of starting to arrive at these sort of numbers, and they will help to advise and inform the advice that we provide through to ministers around ultimately, what is the right number of entities for New Zealand and where should those boundaries be drawn. So you'll see a number in there on that slide. I think it's the fourth bullet point down that sort of says in the order of $110 to $170 billion. We think that high number is probably sort of a bit too high. But actually, to be honest, whether it's 100 billion, 110 billion, 120 or 130 billion, it's actually neither here nor there. The reality is that it is a significant step up from what we have been investing. And as I said before, the way the sector is currently sort of arranged and constructed, then we're not going to be able to meet that, but there is enough money in the system if we make some reforms. So just as an example, one of the slides, again, this is taken from the first set of analysis that the Water Industry Commission for Scotland did for us. And if you look at the bar graphs on the right-hand side of my screen, the first one sort of gives you an idea from 2019 from what the base case is. So you've got a lowest sort of household water bill of about $380 going up to about $2,410. If you then look at the 2050 base case, which is what the level of investment is required, and there has been no sort of change or structural change around how water services are delivered. And you can see that the lowest bill's gone up to about $900 and the highest is up over $5,000. And if you look at the average for, again, the rurals, the provincials and the metropolitans, you can see the metropolitans are about $1,500, average for provincials are about $2,500, and your average for the rural councils are about $3,500. However, if you sort of reconstitute the sector and sort of say there will be 5 water entities that sort of cover New Zealand, then largely through both cross-subsidisation and through efficiencies, then you can see that those bills drop quite dramatically, and you're talking somewhere sort of between 700 and 1,300. And if you follow right out to the right-hand side, then you'll see with 2 entities, those bills drop even further, so around about 740 to 980. So, I mean, that's just indicative, but the principle and what you take from that, you know, is essentially what's running through our analysis. If we get into that 3 to 5 sort of entity mark, then the bills actually become affordable. So there is a key message that we sort of are giving to people. Costs are going to rise. People are going to have to pay more for 3 water services. It's just a matter of how much more you're going to pay. So if we stay as we are in the status quo, then you can expect to pay a lot more. But if we do this reform program and change the way water services are delivered, then yes, your costs will rise, but nowhere near as much as what they would otherwise. We've put a slide in here, Joey, just around the whole sort of benefits of scale. So we know that there's a greater financial capability and capacity in there, an ability to use a wider range of funding and financing tools off the council balance sheets, uses its own sort of balance sheet, can sort of borrow at a greater rate, which is really important if you've got a very large investment program. We know that a lot of this is very large, lumpy upfront CapEx expenditure. The whole strengthened sort of operations, and there's I think a real awesome benefit in here in terms of staff and an organisational capability and career sort of pathways. We know what improved asset management can do, something that's very dear to your hearts. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what it allows us to do is to actually get the great outcomes that we want in terms of well-being for our sort of communities. So some of the questions that we've sort of been working through, we first went out to councils in around about July, early August last year, and that was partly to introduce the reform program and where it's now going and what had been agreed between sort of the sector and ministers. But it was also about, well, we've now got quite a few $100 million on the table, and this is what were the processes we need to go through. At that time, they probably asked us about 1,000 questions about what the reform program would do and where it was going to end up and what it was going to look like. We didn't quite have total blank sheets of paper, but we had very little that was actually drawn on it, and most of it was, look, we can answer about 2 questions, and we're going to have to come back and work with you on answering all of the rest of the questions that you have. Where we are now is that we have developed sort of answers or options for a lot of these questions, and that's what we're taking back out and testing with the sector. And the presentation that we are using, which is, how many slides is that up to now, Joey? About 90 slides or something?
Nearly cracked 100, yeah.
Cracked 100 slides, and it goes into a lot more detail, obviously, on some of these sort of elements it's been emailed out to people as we complete each workshop, so it'll probably be on our website, I'd say, in about a week.
Definitely.
Yeah. Awesome. So some of the key questions, obviously, is how many entities and where their boundaries are. And we have got sort of competing priorities and things that we're sort of trying to manage in that side of it. What does a water services entity look like? As I said, it's not going to be a CCO, it's not going to be a Crown entity, it's not a water care, it's not a Wellington Water sort of model. So what is the ownership structure, the governance arrangements, what could they look like? How do we still retain the local voice and influence? Councils are really fundamental in the well-being of their communities. Communities, consumers, households, how do we make sure that we actually retain that local voice and sort of influence? We really have to make sure, as treaty partners, why is why, and We have got a very poor track record of servicing, especially some of your more isolated sort of rural communities, which are predominantly sort of Māori and iwi and hapu sort of based. So a real thinking about the Treaty o Waitangi and Te Mana o Te Wai and how we protect Māori rights and interests through this new system. One of the really and most difficult questions that we've had to deal with is, will the water service entity sort of provide 2 or 3 waters? So drinking water is a given, wastewater is a given. You know, you'll be well aware they are largely reticulated closed sort of networks consisting of treatment plants and pipes, whereas stormwater, you know, only 20% of that network is actually a piped network, and you know, ownership of where all the water comes from when it rains and when it overflows and who owns that land, etc. It's a very, very vexed question. So we'll talk a little bit about where we've got to with that one. I mentioned sort of the whole mechanisms for protecting individual consumers and households. And then obviously these are assets that are owned by communities, you know, through councils at the moment. And councils are rightly asking the question, well, what will this mean for us if they are no longer on our balance sheet? You know, if we are no longer getting the revenue and we're no longer having to do the expenditure, what will this mean for us in terms of you know, our ongoing sort of viability, and so yeah, implications for staff, etc. So that has been one of the key questions we've been working through. And then obviously once we get to the point of actually knowing what a new service delivery arrangement will actually look like, there's a really, really big question of, well, how do we go from where we are now with 67 councils doing this through to whatever the new you know, arrangements are going to be, and how do we manage that transition?
Richard, just before we move too far from our analysis, there is a question in here that has there been an estimate of the deficit between the current and required OPEX? Maybe you could talk to the RFI work that we're doing.
Yeah, so no, I think largely what we've been saying is this is what the investment program is that's required to be made. And we have, I think, sort of focused more on the CapEx sort of side of it. I know the RFI data that we have collected starts to go into that, so that will definitely be one of the considerations that we sort of come through. So just running you through very quickly through a few of those sort of last sort of slides that we've sort of got here. As I said, when we're thinking about numbers and boundaries, we've sort of got a trade-off. We've been asked to look at 3 things. So one of them is how you actually achieve the scale benefits. The second one is around consideration of your sort of communities of interest. And then your third one is we need to consider relevant regulatory boundaries. I mean, at the end of the day, these are, a lot of it is just actually lines drawn on a map, but there are already a number of different regulatory boundaries out there. So how do we sort of work within those and try and align with them as much as possible? If we're looking at scale, then you know it's a no-brainer really. The fewer entities they have, the better scale benefits that you have. So that makes the financials and the economics work a lot better. However, the fewer entities you have works against natural communities of interest. So if you're thinking about a whole of South Island, you know, sort of water entity, you know, it's a little bit hard to argue that you're actually collecting a community of interest in that regard. And we are also paying particular attention to Rohi and Takiwa for iwi, Māori, and whereabouts that sort of fits. So on one hand, we've sort of got the push for fewer entities, but then we've also got the pull really for more entities to be able to deal with communities of interest and relevant regulatory boundaries. We're modelling an awful lot of scenarios based on the RFI data, and you know you can cut these any different way that you sort of want. But if you look on the left-hand side, you see you've got a 2-entity model where you know the scale, it's a really big plus in terms of the scale, but you know very poor in terms of the Rohi, Takiwa and communities of interest and regulatory alignment. Whereas to the right-hand side, you've got sort of more of a regional model where you don't achieve as much in terms of scale benefits, but you are much closer and tick the boxes for the communities of interest, the Rohi and the regulatory sort of alignment. Even if we are looking at, no, you're right, even if we are looking at, you know, how, you know, 2, 3, well, probably more for sort of the 4 or the 5 or the 3 entity sort of model, then there are also lots of different ways you can cut that model as well. What does a water entity look like? I will push this one through relatively fast. It will build on the screen as we sort of go, but Ultimately, you have a water entity which will have a board, and it will have sort of management. Entity will presumably appoint a chief executive, who will then appoint the rest of the staff. You will have some enabling legislation which will do what a legislation does. It will sort of set out what the purpose of the entity is and what the powers are and what the restrictions are on them, and sort of any requirements around how they sort of operate, and sort of governance features. Now, because we're talking large entities, it's likely that within the boundaries of these entities, there will be potentially multiple mana whenua, and there will be multiple local authorities. So for argument's sake, you could have 10 or 13 or 19 local authorities. They will all have the ability, along with the mana whenua, to appoint a governance representative group that will represent them. There will be a process they'll have to go through to do that. How much of that we specify in legislation is an open question. But it's likely, especially for the mana whenua side of it, that's something that we leave to mana whenua to work out what's the best way to do that. So ultimately, you end up with a governor's representative group, which will be relatively small, maybe 5, 6, 7, and they will have a job of appointing an independent sort of selection panel, who will then appoint the board. And that's just to make sure that we actually have experts in play who can actually make those board appointments, rather than just leaving it up to, again, the risk, I guess, of the governor's representative group is that you don't end up necessarily with the people who've got the right skills to appoint the right board. Entity is going to have to answer to and then set out how they will respond to the strategic and performance expectations from the governor's sort of representative group. So you could expect that to be through things like letters, sort of a letter of expectations, and then a statement of intent sort of in response. But the entity is also going to need to have a whole lot of sort of key planning and strategic documents now. So they will be things like strategic asset management plans, what their pricing and their charging plan is, what their investment prioritisation process and plans will be. And so they will all need to be gone through process of engagement and consultation and sort of sign off, and a chance for the governors to input into that. I mentioned stormwater, where we've sort of got to, and I'll draw your attention to the very last box on that slide. So as a starting proposition, ministers have recently agreed really that we will be working on the basis of 3 waters. So that ministers will be exploring further the transfer of stormwater infrastructure into the new water services entities. And we have established a new technical working group to help to develop this one out. So on one hand, when you talk stormwater in an urban context, it's much easier, and you can see how that will fit in. But as soon as you get sort of further out and into the more rural or provincial sort of areas, then it becomes a lot harder. So we are working on the basis that we will be doing 3 waters. It's just whether we will have all of stormwater in, or what components of stormwater will be in on day one. Still to work through. And I think overriding the fundamental thing that was driving ministers, and probably driving our advice to ministers too, was if we focus back on the outcomes, that actually we probably can't deliver the outcomes and why we're doing this review if we leave stormwater out.
This segues into a question that we have through the Q&A tool that is extremely complex when it comes to stormwater, which is regarding ownership. Presumably that doesn't include Three Waters assets on public conservation land. That's a question that we have that's come through.
No, so this is the sort of thing that we will explore in a 6-hour workshop with councils. We are only talking at this stage around council owned assets. So private supplies, and sort of sole supplies, people with rainwater tanks, etc. So anyone who's not connected up to a council supply at the moment, we're not focused on them. We are just talking about the council owned sort of assets. The Crown also has a number of assets, so Conservation, Ministry of Education, Corrections, etc. They are all not included in this either, but they are also got the same level of investment, and be fair to say that they're very keen for us to take it over and to solve the funding question for them as well. Emerging sort of ideas around the transition. So this is just a couple of key messages we want to get out there. This work is only just sort of starting, in part because we haven't actually resolved what it is the new system is going to look like, how many entities, the boundaries. and therefore it's actually really hard to work out how you transition, from what you've got now to something which is still unknown. But we have sort of kicked off a work stream, and we're getting some pretty clear messages back that this is going to be a major piece of work, and we're really going to have to make sure that it provides security and certainty for staff sort of through this process. But we are very committed to the fact that it will be a smooth transition from our current system into this new system. If you look at the next slide, Joey, then we've sort of got a couple of different areas that we're focused. So the next year is going to be sort of setting up the transition and sort of establishing that sort of process. There will need to be a high level of sector involvement and engagement, even more so than what we have had to date around getting this one right. There will then be a couple of years where we'll probably have something like an establishment unit, and we'll be talking about things like shadow boards and interim sort of CEs, etc., of the new water entities to sort of help get them operationally ready, and then an implementation sort of phase. But yeah, exactly how all the phases are going to work, as I said, it's not sort of hasn't gone through and been signed off by sort of cabinet yet. The key point around the transition is that we are targeting all water services entities to go operationally live on the 1st of July 2024. And that has been designed for two reasons. Number one is that it gives us time to actually make sure we run a smooth transition process. But number two, it lines up really well with the councils and the LTP sort of period. So a message that we are giving, sort of out to local government, as we sort of go around the country, is that you need to be planning for, designing, investing, as if these reforms aren't happening, and that you will be responsible for this right the way through, for the next 3 years. And then a water services entity, the earliest is likely to take over is 1 July 2024. But on day one, it's actually debatable about how much will actually change. Obviously, a lot has to be gone through into the transition side of it, but it's likely that the same projects that your staff, the council staff are working on now will still be the same projects that they are working on Monday, the 1st of July 2024. So projects that are in the process of being constructed and being designed, etc., will still sort of continue through. It's likely that the water entities will pick up a lot of the asset management plans that councils are developing and do develop going through the next sort of 3 years. And then it's probably 3-4 years after that before you actually start to see probably big departures from what the existing program sort of is. We are going to need an absolutely massive industry transformation process here. That much is just a given. We are dramatically going to need to increase and provide certainty through the supply chain. We're going to need a whole workforce development, recruitment, retention, training. It is going to be a absolutely massive opportunity, and just a really, really exciting time, I think, to be part of the three water sector. We just cannot, even with efficiencies, we just can't deliver a double to tripling of the program over the next 30 years, unless we actually, have the staff, have the supply chain that can actually support that. And then I've sort of covered most of sort of the time frame, and we can sort of send you these slides. Obviously will sort of be available, but if you look at the next steps, well, we're in sort of ongoing analysis now, continuing with our advice, continuing with engagement in iwi sort of Māori. We are looking at cabinet decisions in the middle of this year, so May sort of June sort of period, and then introducing, I guess, the legislation to create the entities late this year, with that being enacted in the middle of next year. And then where it really gets interesting, I guess, for councils is that we will be working with them over that July, August sort of period, and ultimately providing information to them so that for the last quarter of this year, sort of September to December, they have all the information that they need and the ability to discuss and talk to their communities, and then make a decision about whether they are staying in the reforms or whether they are opting out of reforms. So the councils themselves will be put into a new water services entity, and if they will have to make a decision basically, and their decision is it's either staying in or they make a decision to opt out. And just a final thing, I'll just make a note there. What we're well aware of is that the current Local Government Act, provisions around making a decision like this don't actually allow councils to make a decision on this one, because it's there are provisions within the LGA that prohibit them, I guess, opting out of water services sort of delivery. So we are making some urgent legislative changes at the moment that'll be coming into Parliament probably within about a month. That sets up a bespoke process for councils to be able to make this decision legally. Let's really ask some sort of questions, Joe.
Yeah, I apologise, Amari. I took some of those questions as we went through, but I'll leave the rest to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Kia ora tātou, everybody. It's Murray Pugh, Chief Executive IPWA. Thank you so much, Richard, for taking us through that presentation. We do have, at the moment, 3 questions, which I'll work through. Probably the one which is perhaps the most controversial, from Peter Thompson. Thanks, Peter, for asking this and articulating it so well. I'll just read it out for you. So you rather skipped over the implications for staff, although you did touch on that towards the end of the presentation again, in terms of the excitement and the opportunity in the future. Peter goes on, the local government sector presently employs a total combined workforce of an estimated 2,500 to 3,000 staff. Perhaps this number could be confirmed. Why is none of the 3 water reforms documentation talking about how these people, critical resources, are going to be treated or catered for? Peter understands Scottish Water was established with about 3,700 staff, originally transferred from local authorities. And within their first 12 months of operation, staff numbers had reduced to about 2,500 staff through managed redundancies. Is this similar efficiency gain expected in the New Zealand reforms? So there's a couple of questions in there.
Absolutely, thanks, and thanks, Peter. It's a really good question, and yes, when we were talking to council, this is the number one probably sort of priority sort of for them, and it will be the number one priority sort of for us for the transition. We need to provide certainty and security to staff, because we essentially shoot ourselves in the foot if we end up just losing a whole lot of people from the sector through these reforms and through this transition. So yes, that will be an absolute critical one, and in fact we run a couple of polls. We're out doing our council workshops at the moment to just to gather a little bit more information from this, and also from them to talk to their staff so that we can start the planning for it really, really early. What I would also say though is actually, if you look at what's happened in the Scottish Water sort of example, that overall through Scottish Water and through the supply chain over there, they've actually added about 4,000 new jobs into the 3 water sector than what they had done previously, and the majority of those jobs are actually located more out into the provinces and out into the regions. So what tended to happen, I guess, is that you saw perhaps some of the more centralised function jobs sort of attrition over time, but actually what you saw with the investment program is you saw that growth in certainly much more of the operational and the delivery sort of roles in the supply chain, and it was not in the national offices where those jobs happened. I expect you'd see something similar in New Zealand, but exactly how, we'll see if we can model that, and we will need to provide that certainty.
It strikes me that the time horizon for those sorts of changes is reasonably long.
Yeah, I think it is. It's going to be quite a big ask, the transition, but we do think it's actually a reasonable time period to undertake that sort of transition. And as I said, we're not going to also just suddenly be able to double or triple our investment program. So on Monday, the 1st of July 2024, we're investing $1.7 billion or $1.5 billion. And then on Tuesday, the 2nd of July, we're investing $3 billion. That is there's a real question for us actually, is we think the level of investment that we require is almost maybe too large to try and fit into a 30-year period, notwithstanding the fact that we've got a major workforce development and whole supply chain sort of process that needs to go through. But is it actually so bad that we need to be starting to talk about this as a 40-year investment sort of horizon?
That sort of leads quite nicely into a question from James Thorne. Is there work that needs to get started now so that we get ahead of implementation and establishment issues when the new entities are made live? James can think of data standards and data federation as a key issue, for example, and who might lead that work.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that is very much what we're establishing. At the moment, we've got about a very small sort of transition work stream, but that transition work stream will grow dramatically over the next 6 months, and then the following 6 months. There is a real question in here about how much we centralise and how much we mandate centrally versus how much we leave up to the entities to, I guess, sort of develop on in a way that sort of meets their region's sort of needs. But one thing that I'll be quite clear on through previous work that I have done is what we do around asset management, what we do around asset management systems, what we do around data standards and data is something that will be consistent across the country so that we don't end up with the system that we sort of have now. But yes, I fully expect that a lot of those things like IT and procurement and those sort of things, there will be a lot of synergies and efficiencies that can be gained from 6 entities procuring sort of as one rather than 67 councils procuring individually.
The next 3 questions sort of largely around scope from Michael Hodder, Ken Mitchell and Mr. or Ms. Oakley. Are rural stockwater schemes owned by councils included in the reform program?
Rural stockwater schemes owned by councils. In general, anything that is owned by and delivered by sort of councils are included. What we do find is that in many cases, that's quite a murky question once we actually sort of dig into it, almost on an individual case-by-case sort of basis, because a lot of this stuff is quite historical and it's been through a variety of different arrangements and trying to untangle it. So the general principle is that if it is council owned and operated, then yes, it is included within this. But as I said, there is a few that are out there on the margins, which is actually quite difficult to sort of untangle. In those cases there, it'll probably end up being a case-by-case basis.
Next one is related to stormwater. Is stormwater likely to be reticulated systems rather than drainage flood schemes?
Yeah, so that's where I was sort of saying there's quite a wide spectrum and complexity involved in obviously the 2 waters and the stormwater sort of world. So the obvious ones are, things especially in the urban areas where it is a reticulated network, then that's actually a lot easier to fit into, a new service delivery model and becomes 3 waters. But yes, and much less likely to be sort of especially or very unlikely to be the rural drainage and flooding sort of schemes. But where you draw that line in the middle is what we've just got a reference group, expert reference group to start to work through with us.
Right. I'll sort of add in my own question and on top of that, even in the reticulated schemes, the overlap between roading networks and stormwater networks is critical. How is that being worked through?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily going to put Miles right on the spot, but the technical expert sort of group that we've just set up for stormwater is headed up by David Warburton, who is sort of he's a water person from a long way back, but actually most recently was heading up sort of Auckland Transport. So we have particularly looked for people who are able to help work through those complexities of issues where a large amount of your stormwater and your is reliant upon roads and other sort of people who own it rather than just councils.
Yeah. Another question from James Thorne here. How will you combat the temptation for councils to pull back Three Waters funding over the next 3 years in an attempt to reduce the rate burden on their patch, hoping that the larger scale entities will pick up the costs in the future?
Yeah, that is actually a temptation, but and we're still to work through exactly what the sort of the financial side of it will look like. But again, as a principle, the assets will transfer over, but also the debt will also transfer over. And if you go back to what I sort of said in terms of the transition sort of period and what might happen, between Sunday the 30th of June and then Monday the 1st of July in 2024, it's highly likely that the water services entities are, their first order of business is going to be to complete and to run with the projects that are already underway. So in a way, actually, I think there's possibly a higher risk once people start to understand it of councils actually commit to invest in and try and get a whole lot more projects underway and incur the debt, because then those projects get completed by the water services entity without their ratepayers, having to fund it via sort of rates. So yeah, there is a natural sort of tension in there that we're just going to have to work through.
I imagine obviously the Auditor General will have an oversight function in this transition period, particularly of particular strength. Yeah,
and one of the things that we're going to need to do is to, as I said, we are absolutely committed to making sure that it's a smooth transition and that we actually achieve the objectives that we want. So how do we actually build from an official and a program sort of perspective, how do we build those checks and balances in? How do we provide that assurance to us that we are actually doing this in a good way? And that may well even involve OAG at that sort of level. But yes, these water entities too will also, because they will be publicly owned sort of entities, they will also be subject to audit and OAG oversight, just like councils.
Question, will there be any residual 2 or 3 water duties imposed on local authorities once the transfer to the new entities is completed?
Yeah, a little bit early to know, but one of the things, as I said, when we were sort of working through the 2 waters or 3 waters question, but one of them was, the influencing factors was that councils were telling us is that if they lose the 2 waters, the drinking water and wastewater, then what they will typically do is to seriously erode their capacity to then deal with stormwater. And so actually they would rather, in those cases, that we took the whole thing, because then they just were seen, left with a bit of a hospital pass. So yeah, once we work through and get more detail around how the stormwater sort of work and what will be in scope for that one, we'll be able to better answer that. But we are very conscious of things like overheads and sort of stranded assets, etc., in councils, and that will be part of the whole process of working out what transfers over.
I'm aware that we have just 3 minutes of the hour remaining. We have two remaining questions. Many local council water supplies are operated by external contractors, either CCOs or private entities. Is the thinking with the new water entities that the operations and maintenance of these suppliers be delivered by the water entities in-house?
Yeah, the answer is probably we aren't thinking about that at this stage, and I don't know that we would actually end up thinking about that. Again, it comes back to that question of what do we sort of mandate or require centrally versus what do we leave up to the entities, and I suspect that that'll be very much be an operational decision that the entities will make about what they do in-house versus what they contract out. And they'll probably go through a variety of different factors and rationale to sort of come up with those answers.
And the final question I think we have time for from Will Ralston. We talk about large investments needed in infrastructure in all areas of New Zealand. But do we have the resources to complete this work? Is the training of qualified and competent staff being considered after the implementation of the new entity? And I'd actually suggest before the implementation as well.
Yeah. So the answer is no. We do not have the resources to complete this work. And so about 2 hours ago, I was sitting on the construction accord, sort of one of the construction accord meetings. You've just seen the announcements yesterday from housing. You would have seen the Auckland transport announcements from the other week. We are saying that we do have a massive infrastructure program that's needed in New Zealand, and so we are not well set up to be able to deliver that. And yes, we will be starting right from the transition, really from a couple of months from now, on what the workforce development sort of side of that needs to be, so that yes, we are well placed in 10 years, 15 years, 5 years from now, but certainly not on Monday the 1st of July 2024.
Yeah. We have got through all the questions which have been posted, so thank you very much to our audience for participating in the webinar today. Thank you very much, Richard and Josephine, for giving us your time. At IPWA, we're very much going to be part of that workforce development and capability and competency development over the next period of time to make our contribution to these reforms both effective and to help the efficiencies which they're aimed at to be realised for the benefit of the whole country. So from my point of view, I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you everybody for your participation in the webinar this afternoon.
Thanks.
Just before we take off, and I think Richard has one more just before we take off, I would encourage, if you're interested in all of this, to keep an eye on our webpage, Three Waters Reform Programme, at dia.gov.nz. We are putting a lot of materials up online, so we went through maybe 20 of a 100-page slide pack today. We will be putting that whole slide pack that we're using with council. So if there are areas of detail you were missing from today, that will be up there. Also, as we progress, that's where we put things like the cabinet papers once they're released and key decisions. So it is really updated in a living web page.
So one of the things that we posted was just a 10-slide page, sort of pack slide. 10-slide pack on economic regulation and how that will fit into it. We haven't even touched on that today. And Murray and Miles, we're more than happy to come back and run further webinars as we sort of go through. I think the final thing I was going to say is that it's been about 9 years of work with Miles on this so far, and I'd say we've got at least 9 more years to go, Miles.
Yeah, you're probably not wrong, mate.
Fantastic.
Thank you
you
very
all.
much.
Awesome. Thank you, people.